Okidok. Så idag ska vi prata klimat. Ja just det, och jag misslyckades med utskriften. Det gick inte, så jag får ta det på pausen också. Men vi ska prata utifrån de här anteckningarna. Jag har inte heller hunnit med en PowerPoint, men det ska nog inte göra något. Så det blir lite som jag drog väldigt översiktligt igår var det väl. Men nu tar vi lite lugnare och så pratar vi i detalj om de här artiklarna och lite annat. Så vad har vi i struktur? Planners economy, damage and benefit functions, first best allocation of resources. Och sen har vi laissez-faire, vad håller på att hända? Vilka andra marknadsmisslyckanden behöver vi beakta? Och sen vilka skillnader är det då mellan laissez-faire och vad planeraren skulle göra? Och sen hur ska vi hantera det här? Givet för att försöka minska de här skillnaderna. Givet de här andra marknadsmisslyckanden som vi måste också beakta. Och givet kostnaderna för att genomföra vår politik, till exempel att mäta folks utsläpp eller företagens utsläpp och så vidare. Så vi börjar med planerarens ekonomi. Okej. Så hjälp mig lite här. Nej, nu.
Jag tänkte spela in för fel.
Ja, just det.
Han är på engelska.
Ja. Bra fråga. Jag tror han får klara sig. Oh, what do you say? Maybe we'll do it in English. Why not? It feels kind of odd. We'll see. I'll try and do it in English. So, hi Fredrik, if you're there. Alexander just asked what language, if I thought about that. I'm going to do it in English, but I'll probably end up switching back to Swedish. You can remind me if small triggers can switch me over to English, to Swedish. So. Okay. So, how do we take me through it? How do we? Here comes Fredrik. How do we measure damage and benefit functions? Or give me some thoughts for climate or in general. How do we go about it? So if you think of these curves, where this is emissions per year and dollars per year. Give me some thoughts.
Well, the graph that
Hi. Don't worry, we were just talking about you because I was recording the video and speaking in Swedish, and then Alexander was like, hang on, what about Fredrik? So I just switched to English actually before you appeared. So we're on measuring damages and benefits of emitting carbon dioxide and other stuff, or emitting greenhouse gases. How do we go about that? I just wanted some thoughts. I think you were just kicking off, weren't you?
Yeah, well, if you just look at the graph, somehow we calculate what 1 unit of emission per year, how that affects the economy in dollars per year also. Maybe that's
So that's the you're thinking of the damage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And how do we, because these are completely separate problems, aren't they? At least if we think in a compartmentalized way. Then, of course, there could be sort of feedbacks and things that kind of link them. But that's, as is pointed out in some of these papers, that kind of stuff is way beyond what the current models can do, basically. So we treat them totally separately. So how will we go about working out what damages are caused by carbon dioxide emissions? So if you think of lead emissions to the air, how can we go about working out what damages are caused by lead emissions to the air? Which I talked about before, right?
Yeah.
So just remind me or yourselves.
I think you talked about you can measure them like in school results, stuff
Right.
like that. Yeah.
So there, you've got basically a flow polluter. The lead is emitted to the air, and then, I don't know exactly, but I could imagine within a few days, it's sort of heavy stuff, lead. It's going to end up back on the ground. And in that period that it's in the air, kids breathe it in, or we all breathe it in. But luckily, if you're an adult, your brain is fully developed, so it's not as serious. But if your brain is developing, it's obviously more serious to have something mucking around with your brain. And we can measure the effect on their kids' intellectual capacity, basically. And then, of course, we have to put a value on that, which is pretty intangible, and you might say, well, wow, you know, this is just so bad that we shouldn't be emitting any lead at all. Whatever, you know, we just don't care, this is crazy. And I think that is definitely a sort of defensible attitude in this case. But if we're going to try and put a monetary value on to get a sort of minimum, you could say, well, look, we know that people with higher, better school results earn more and contribute more to the economy, because when you earn more, you're producing more stuff which other people consume and so on. So we can use that to sort of put some kind of minimum level on the damages. Just if we calculate in this extremely narrow way, we still get all this damage, which is way more. Well, yeah, and then if we take the lead case, how would you measure the benefits of adding the lead? So that's really straightforward, actually.
The company profits, or?
Kind of, yeah, but in more specifically.
Like GDP growth or something?
Nah. Fredrik had his, what do you want to
Price of save lead, because with higher efficiency, we want the same outcome, we would need fewer fuel.
less fuel, yeah.
Less fuel, so the difference basically, and then put a price on it.
Yeah. So it's basically the fuel we save. We add lead, which is costly, but we save, by adding lead, we save fuel, which is also costly, and it turns out the fuel we save is worth more than the lead we add it in. So we just save money in a very straightforward way. So then in that case, it's super straightforward, and you basically end up with a benefit function that kind of is going to look like this. It's a straight line, more or less. This is when you use lead-free fuel, and this is when you use the amount that you would add in the free market. And then you could add loads more lead, which would just sort of choke the engines and stuff, or whatever. And we would never do. Yeah, these parts of the curve, this part of the curve is never really that relevant. So that's lead. But if you think of climate, it's so much trickier in so many ways. Right? So what would the corresponding thing be to the sort of kids' brain damage? What kind of things can we say is the relatively concrete effects, measurable effects of increased climate, or of increased greenhouse gas emissions? Like what sector would we kind of hope is a kind of obvious one to home in on?
Agriculture.
Right, agriculture. And if we've got the sort of regional effects, if we can spatially disaggregate the climate changes and say, look, okay, in this region of the world it's going to get X degrees warmer and there'll be Y% more or less more rainfall. But then what damages is that going to cause? It's like, wow. Like what could you imagine doing? You've got, if this is years, and this is like average summer temperatures, you've got variation, yeah, in the summer temperatures, say. And then you could say, oh, what happens to harvest? Or profit, the harvest or the profits of harvest. It might be like, yeah. So would this be a good basis then for, look, in this really hot year we had a massive harvest shortfall. Could you then say, okay, so then we know if this is going to be the new normal, then we can look at this shortfall and say, this is the cost. Give me thoughts on that. Are we like done there? It's a leading question, we're not, but why not? What's the problem? There's a massive problem with this. Yeah, the agriculturalist.
We said this would be temperature, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, this is really simplified, but...
yeah, I was thinking, okay, as effects, because temperature usually would go along with a lot of sun, so these conditions wouldn't be bad if there isn't enough precipitation.
Okay, yeah, you're thinking it kind of too much like the agriculturalist in a way. It's not that... Imagine that temperature is the only thing that matters. Okay. To make this example simple. Okay. So temperature is the only thing that matters for a crop yield. Okay. So we could have a more sophisticated example, and I could have drawn changes in different dimensions and so on. But let's just, okay. So still there's a big, big problem with this.
Could the increase in temperature affect other areas that then would affect the crop yield?
It's a lot simpler than that. And it's a kind of economic, you need to try to think like economists. Or not, I mean it's, okay, let me just tell you what I'm thinking. Or I'll try to lead you along the way I'm thinking. Okay, so farmers, this is average temperature, isn't it? Okay. And then, so you can see here pretty clearly, this is like the norm. And then you get these years when something weird happens. So we could have had a year like this too, yeah, with the summer was a washout, yeah, and then we might get very low as well. And in the average years, that's when we maximize. So when this is basically showing that when temperature differs radically from what's expected, you get a lot lower yield. Which makes an awful lot of sense, right? Because what crops do you choose in general?
The ones that work with the average.
Right. But if in climate change, in the climate change scenario, you know, a gap of 20, 30 years, and then this is every summer. Are we going to be down here on this lower yield? Why not?
We adapt.
We're going to adapt, yeah. We're going to plant stuff that thrives in these conditions. Okay. So you can't just extrapolate from these years and say this is going to be agricultural production in the future, right? So what can you do? Well, you need to say, look, in the future in Sweden, the climate is going to be kind of like the current climate in northern France or something. But it won't be because the daylight hours are still the same and so on. So you need to try to find somewhere, hopefully on the same latitude, which will have a similar temperature and rainfall profile to what you expect to have in the future in Sweden, and then say, okay, how does agriculture go there? And then you say, this is how it's going to be in Sweden in 30 years or 50 years. Then you would have something. But typically that's going to be really, really hard to find. Because, yeah, like I said, if you compare to northern France, well then, you don't have, the seasons are all wrong, yeah, because you still have these very long nights and a very short growing season in Sweden, even if it gets much hotter. But of course, it's a combination of that kind of thing plus modelling. You need to build models of, like, okay, what will farmers do in this future and how will this pan out? But it's really tricky and it's going to be quite speculative, right? And this was remember what I said? I said, what's the most concrete area, the easiest area to find the damages? Yeah, this is the easiest one, and it's not easy. Then you can talk about, okay, well, climate change, if it's going to create if this is turning an area into a desert or something, it's pretty clear that there's not going to be any agriculture. You know, you could make fairly strong predictions that in some areas, you know, agriculture is going to disappear, and then you say, okay, this is going to lead to migration, conflict, etc. Wow, how are you going to model that and predict how that is going to pan out and what the benefits and costs are? Okay, it's a nightmare trying to get this damage curve. And then like my general view is like we're kind of like humans are kind of like rats. Okay. Which might sound very value-laden statement, but I'm not using that in a value-laden way. The comparison is about how adaptable we are. We kind of adapt to different climates, different situations. And of course, we do it. Rats do it. I don't know how rats do it, because they're just so damn tough. We're not very tough at all, but we have all these technologies to help us, like clothing, which we developed about 100,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago. But then a lot of other stuff that helps us. So these kind of apocalyptic scenarios for climate change in terms of the effects on humans, wow. Then to me, it's it's a distributional question in that case. It's like the most vulnerable humans who don't have access to technology and so on. They can have these really apocalyptic outcomes. We're going to be fine. Okay. Except to the extent that we really dislike seeing other humans suffering, which is hopefully to a great extent. But if you're trying to motivate it by the fact that we are actually going to suffer a physical apocalypse, it's not going to happen. That's my view. But what are the sort of most apocalyptic scenarios? Especially like for us, say, if you think of things that really could throw quite a massive spanner in the works.
Sea level rise?
It's these massive sea level rise predictions. Well, they're not. In the models, it's like this could happen at sort of 1% or whatever. It could be that whatever ice shelf slides off into the Antarctic Ocean and melts. And then, I can't remember how big the biggest extreme scenarios are, but they're pretty big, aren't they? It's like 10, 15 meters, I think. Is anyone really up on this stuff? It's not my main subject area, and I haven't had time to look at it. But it's that kind of interval. Like the main models are saying, look, maybe a meter. It's that kind of amount in 100 years, kind of thing. So it's like, okay, if we can build a flood defense this high, that's it. Kind of, we're fine for the low-lying cities. It's not apocalypse, right? But if you're talking 15 meters, I mean, you're going to have a lot of major cities. You just can't defend against that, I would guess. So you'd have to just move up to the high ground. I mean, that would be phenomenally costly compared to the cost of today switching away from fossil fuels and using the alternatives which we already have. But there the key problem is the science. Like how likely or unlikely are these apocalyptic scenarios? And it's this tail thickness thing, right? Have you all looked at that video on tail thickness? Yeah. So if you have this probability distribution function, for the sort of standard distribution functions, generally, the expected damage ends up, or the expected value ends up close to the sort of most likely value, so to speak. But if this doesn't taper off quick enough, the expected value can actually be way over here, which basically means that these unlikely but apocalyptic scenarios are sort of driving the policy. And we kind of, it seems, this isn't my research area really at all, but it seems like we definitely need to take these apocalyptic scenarios seriously. It's still not going to end up with the sort of end of humanity or something, but it could be massive costs compared to massive damage costs compared to the foregone benefits by shifting this way. So even if it's very, very unlikely, it still could be driving the optimal policy. Okay. So that's damage. Really, really tricky to estimate this. What about the benefits? So we talked about The lead benefits, yeah. Really, really straightforward. What about greenhouse gas benefits? What are the economic benefits of being able to emit greenhouse gases? How uncertain is that? How do we measure it? Let me give you a starter on that. It varies a lot by sector, how tricky it is. Okay, so give me a sector where it's easy to measure the benefits.
The energy sector? Is that too
Okay, any
broad?
particular, no, absolutely. Any particular part of it? Or can you narrow down? So like we need energy for a lot of different things.
I was gonna say the transportation sector, but maybe that's not so easy.
It depends which part.
Like transportation of goods. Or like
By,
shipping, like, I don't know, overseas
Easier
shipping.
ship stuff, because there's more water.
so shipping is a little bit tricky because it's like if you take away the fossil fuels, if we're looking at trying to find this point, kind of, and to compare it to this one, where we are now. So then you need to know what would we do without the fossil fuels. If you know that, then you can find the gap and say, okay, this is the benefit, kind of. And we don't really know, I don't think. If we took away fossil fuels, how would we ship everything around, or would we just stop shipping? It's quite tricky. There's other areas where it's easier. Frederick?
I was thinking of heating. I don't know, houses or wood, just heating in general. So we have a temperature rise, so you don't have to heat. Yeah, I don't know. You save such and such liters oil or whatever.
I'd say heating, so what would we do? If we couldn't use fossil fuels for heating, what would we do?
Use solar panels.
Right, so it's kind of, where there's clear alternatives and we know what we would do without the fossil fuels, then it's kind of easy to measure this. And I would say, for heating, so how do we heat? In Sweden, we use combined heat and power, don't we, mainly to heat, space heating, which is kind of somewhat dubious. Depends what you power it with. When you power it with peat, it's an absolute catastrophe. I think I talked about that in one of the videos, didn't I? Even though people defend that, but it's crazy. If you can power it with waste, then it's probably a good idea. But if you think of just electricity generation in general, that's like a really pretty clear-cut case where we already see, like we know we have these alternative technologies. We're using both in parallel. We know the costs in different areas and so on of the alternatives. We know, we can say, if we just do a thought experiment and say in 10 years we're not using any fossil fuels for electricity generation anymore, we could pretty easily say in that case we'll be doing this, that and the other, and the costs will be X, Y, Z for electricity generation, and probably for space heating as well. Whereas if you said, okay, we're not going to use fossil fuels for driving boats anymore, or shipping, wow, what would you do? I don't know. I don't think anyone would really be able to answer that question confidently today. So that would be, and definitely for like air transport, it's like, okay, would we all just fly a lot less, which would be costly in terms of, this is economic benefits, yeah, people like flying around and they wouldn't get to fly as much, so that would be a big loss. Would we use biofuels? Trouble with biofuels is that then we're taking space from nature. So biofuels are really, really double-edged sword, so to speak. Because a parallel problem with climate change is that we're taking space from nature across globally, that we're leaving less and less of the globe for nature, and we're taking over more and more for ourselves. And of course, in a sense, growing biofuels is nature too, but it's very much nature on our conditions, and like few species, the ones that we want, and other species are not welcome, kind of thing. And we don't, many of us, especially in the richer countries, we don't like that either. We value having areas left on nature, for nature to sort of get on with it on its own, so to speak. So biofuels are definitely no panacea for climate change, despite what many people at SLU would like to claim, but they see a great future for SLU with a bioeconomy. Everything's going to be run on bio in the future, according to many people at SLU. This is the future, but I don't see it that way. Because, I mean, the area of the globe has got enough pressure on it as it is, with us making food, or producing food, without us also using it to produce fuel for energy. Okay. So the problems here are not nearly as big as these problems. And some of the major areas like electricity production is like a massive, massive source of carbon dioxide emissions and heat, space heating. And there we know pretty well, we can measure pretty accurately. I mean, it's not going to be perfect, but we've got a pretty good idea. Compared to the uncertainties here, you know, it's nothing. Okay. So how do we actually go about this? So I've taken you through one model in the video. So I thought I don't want to just do that again. So I'm going to take you through another one. Okay. I'm going to take you through the most famous one. Which is DICE. Okay. Aha. I'm not going to do this like super detailed or anything, because I think it's going to be quite tricky with the screen and stuff. But we're just going to have a look at 2 or 3 equations. Because you might well have this idea that, oh, Nordhaus, you've all heard of Nordhaus, right? And DICE. Have you all heard of DICE? Okay, so DICE is sort of his big integrated assessment model that he's been working on since the 70s, basically, or at least the 80s. So this is his climate model, basically, that he kind of got the Nobel Prize for. Simplified. And he's basically, there's a very simple optimization software called GAMS, and he's programmed it in GAMS, and this is how it looks. Okay. Can you all see this? Just about? Yeah? Okay. So this is the beta version of DICE 2060. Blah, blah, blah. So what have we got here? Parameters. So he's defining a bunch of parameters, saying gamma, it's capital elasticity, and it's equal to 0.3, and so on. Okay? So that's all this is. So there's a lot of parameters in this model. And here's some more parameters But these ones vary over time. But they're called parameters because they vary exogenously. Okay, they vary in a predetermined way. Not, you all know this exogenous, endogenous thing, right? And some further definitions. This is parameters that are functions of other parameters. Okay. Okay. Then we've got some variables. So these are determined in the model. Okay. So what sort of things have we got? This is emission control rate. So this is abatement, isn't it? I don't know what this MIU, you have something in mind what that stands for, I have no idea. Radiative forcing, so this is how much the stock of gases is pushing up the temperature, driving, how strong the driving force upwards on temperature is. Then we've got temperature changes in the atmosphere and the ocean, carbon concentration in the ocean, and so on. Emissions per year, subsets of that, industrial emissions. So the difference between these would be like forest emissions and so on. Consumption, capital, investment, savings, GDP. GDP after allowing for abatement and damages, gross GDP before allowing for abatement and damages, etc. Okay. And then we just, this is for the sake of the program, you name the equations. Okay. And this is the model. Okay. So what have we got? Let's go to the economic variables. Y gross. Do you remember what that was? It's your baseline GDP before damages. Okay? And what's that? It's AL, which is going to be the productivity of labor. Okay, so A often stands for productivity in these macro models. Times the amount of labor. So the productivity of labor times the amount of labor you've got, that's like the effective amount of labor after allowing for productivity. So if you double the quantity of labor or double the productivity of the same amount of labor, it amounts to the same thing in these models. You've got effectively twice as much labor. And that is raised to the 1 minus gamma. Like gamma was 0.3. And then you've got capital raised to the gamma. Does that remind you of anything from second year macro? Yes, it should do. I'll put the pressure on now. What does it remind you of?
The gamma part, or
So we've got this production function, which is y equals ALL to the 1 minus gamma k to the gamma. It's a Cobb-Douglas production function for aggregate production, absolutely. And it's the same production function as is used in another Nobel Prize winner's model.
So,
He got his, no, I can't remember when he got his Nobel Prize. The model was from 1956. So, yeah. Okay. So it's like a super simple production function, right? And then what is net GDP? It's the solo GDP times 1 minus damages. What does that remind you of? Think of the videos. It's basically, it's the same as the Golosov, Hassler, Crusoe model that you're knocking off. So this is worked out as a function of temperature and stuff. And so the sort of given temperature, carbon stock and whatever, it knocks off a given proportion of your GDP. So if you have disaggregated countries, each country will lose the same percentage of its GDP in this. So your absolute loss is much higher, or it's twice as high if your GDP is initially twice as high. And then you also lose your abatement cost. To get the final available production to then spend on consumption or investment or so on, you need to take the production after allowing for damages and then take away what you spend on abatement. Okay. So then, let's have a look for this abate cost. Okay. Don't know how to use this browser. Okay. So what is abatement cost? It is gross GDP times some cost parameter, I think. I think this is some variable parameter probably. Times MIU, which was, do you remember MIU? I said, why has he chosen that MIU? This is raised to the power of a parameter.
Was it the emission?
MIU
Yeah.
was just abatement.
Yeah.
So MIU was the quantity of abatement. Emission control rate. So it's how much you abate. So like, what is this? It's like incredibly simple. Okay, it's not even based on a proper model with, there's no fossil fuels in this model. Okay, there's no like rate of use of coal, rate of use of oil, rate of use of gas. It's like, these are our abatement costs. So if you look, so that would be, if there was anything like that here, it would be in these descriptions, yeah. Okay. There's loads of stuff about like ocean stocks and how they interact and things, which the natural scientists have provided, and then he's translating that into the economic model. But then on the actual economic stuff, it's almost like Mickey Mouse level. So, and actually, the Golosov model is a lot better in some respects. It's much simpler with fewer equations and so on, although in some ways it's a lot more sophisticated, because at least there you have, look, we've got coal, we've got oil, we've got renewables. We add to the price, we put a price on emissions, how are we going to switch between coal, oil, renewables? None of that is here. This is all just, it's going to cost about this to cut emissions. And of course, behind that, he's done some work to try and come up with the parameters, but it's not like transparent. There's no sort of theory there. Okay. So we could spend more time and get to the bottom of this, but it's basically a solo model with an abatement cost function added to it. So you've got like consumption is production minus investment, and capital is built up. This is a solo capital. Do you remember? Like 1 minus delta K plus I is like the next period capital, and so on. Yeah. Okay. So, time for a break. So let me just have a look at my notes. What did I want to tell you? Yeah, so I just wanted to give you an introduction to these IAMs and really show you how incredibly simple they are, from at least, especially from the sort of the way the economics is modeled. That's what we've got at the moment. And a massive problem. Well, there's so many problems, but the biggest problems are to do with how do you measure these damages. Okay, let's stop there. And should we take a 15-minute break? Yeah. And I will... Okay, what would the planner do in first best?
Get rid of coal pretty quickly and focus on cheaper oil, not the, I think you said the Alberta oil,
Right.
oil sands.
Right. So almost the most obvious things, or the most clear-cut things, are actually the things that don't have to do with climate in a way, but have to do with other market failures where we really know. There's so many uncertainties with climate, but we know what's going on with market power. That the Saudis, within inverted commas, have a lot of market power. They drive up the price of oil, and that lets other producers into the market who take advantage, basically, including Norway and the UK, and sort of oil sands and so on. And we know that this is not optimal. The social planner would never do it this way, right? The social planner would do the Saudi oil first. If we forget climate change, the social planner would start on Saudi oil, and then when that was finished or starting to get more expensive because it was running out, you would move on to the next cheapest. And if you add climate change to that, what's the conclusion? So if we buy the integrated assessment model picture of climate damages knocking off a percentage of GDP, what does that imply about the carbon price over time? The social cost of carbon, or the optimal tax in a sort of idealized regulatory setting. So damages are a proportion of GDP. Of global, if you think simply, they're a proportion of global GDP. So what can we say about marginal damages, which is the same as the tax in the idealized situation?
They are not accounted for? No.
No, that's not what I'm after. No, so I'm thinking, imagine you're in the idealized economy, an idealized regulated economy. What path is the carbon tax going to follow? In that, idealized regulated economy.
Same as GDP growth then?
It's going to track GDP growth. Okay. And this is what I talked about at one point in the video. I spent a little bit of time on it, I think, in the Golosov video, because it's one of their results. It's like their equation 12, I think, which I talked about a little bit. That the tax is proportional to GDP. So over time, it's going to grow. So if you imagine imposing the optimal tax in this idealized economy, it could well be that the price of Saudi oil is so cheap and so great for stuff like flying and other things that we'd carry on using it, even in first best, for quite a long time, say 40 years or so. This is kind of what the models are saying. But then in first best, by the time the Saudi oil or the cheap oil is starting to run out, we're shifting onto more expensive oil at the same time as the damage costs have gone up because of rising GDP. So at some point, pretty soon after that, we're going to say, oh, the rest we'll leave in the ground. But in second best, even if you have the Pigovian tax, some of that rest we're extracting now. So then we can't leave it in the ground. So you might think, oh, surely it's good that the Saudi oil price goes up, then we use less. But not necessarily if it means that we use more of this other stuff that should be staying in the ground in first best. And actually the Saudi oil is all pumped up in first best anyway. Okay, so, yeah.
So in the second best scenario, when the prices of alternative fuels or alternative energy goes down, then we'll start using the Saudi oil to a cheaper price also. Is that why? That's the reason why it's bad to not use it now? Or I mean...
Say again.
So...
It's really complicated, this, actually, when you start taking it seriously, which is why there's been hardly any research on it, because nobody can get their heads around it. It's actually a current research project that I've got, but anyway.
So, in the first best, we have only using the Saudi oil until it runs out.
Yeah.
And then we add a more expensive tax each year because of the GDP. And then the alternative energy is going to be cheaper, so then we'll just stop using this.
Yeah.
But in the second best, we're going to use Saudi and the more expensive oil.
Yeah.
And then when the alternative energy goes down, we're still going to have the cheap Saudi oil.
Right.
So then it's still going to be cheaper. Okay.
That's one way that it could pan out.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's all very speculative because we don't know. If we're talking about reality, we just don't know how it's going to pan out. But we can definitely say it's a bad thing that we're using this Albertan oil, for instance, now. It's like...
Why are we saying that the alternative like energies will go down, or like fuels? Is it because of the discount factor at an end?
You mean renewables, or?
Yeah.
So they'll get, as the carbon tax, I think what Johanna was saying was that as the carbon tax goes up, renewables are going to get more and more attractive relative to fossil. So their relative price is going to go down compared to fossil prices. I think that's what you meant, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so one thing we definitely do in first best is stop extracting Albertan oil, for instance, and North Sea oil, which is bad news for the Norwegians. The Albertan oil is a double whammy for two reasons. One is it should stay in the ground long term anyway, whereas Norwegian oil is probably borderline. but the other is that it has higher emissions per barrel than Saudi oil or North Sea. You basically use up energy in making it ready to put into car engines. So you get two sets of emissions from it. Okay. But then there's this whole coal thing. So what do we use coal for? Like oil we use for a lot of different things, but mainly for making cars move and planes move. Because it's so handy. Oil is so great to have on mobile devices, so to speak. Vehicles and things. What do we use coal for? Coal's not great for those, is it? We used to use it for those, for trains, but it's not great for that. What do we use coal for? There's two big things. One is this big stationary power plants to generate electricity, and then the steel production, where we actually use the carbon in coal to suck out, if you like, the oxygen from the iron ore to make purer iron. If you're with me chemically. So iron ore is like Fe2O3. My first degree is in chemistry. But we want, very simplified, we want like Fe. Yeah. So if you throw in lots of carbon, C2Fe2O3, and you throw in 3 carbon atoms into this and heat it all up, you can end up with 4 Fe plus 3 CO2s. Yeah. So you lob in coal and heat up iron ore, and you end up with iron and carbon dioxide. And that is also a big source. And this one is kind of trickier to deal with. They're working on it in Sweden, actually, alternative processes which will be carbon neutral. It's one of that guy, an ex-SLU guy, what's his name? Svante Axelsson. I don't know if any of you have heard of Svante Axelsson. Yeah. He's got a fairly high profile guy. He used to be like the boss, or I don't know which kind of boss, but of, what's it called? Naturskyddsföreningen.
Swedish Society of Nature Conservation.
Yeah. And that was a while back, but he was that for a few years. Anyway, he's been pushing this stuff.
So at the moment there's basically no other way to produce even? So coal is needed for it, or is there?
Yeah, it's kind of intrinsically, yeah, you've got to get rid of this oxygen. So you need something to oxidize it with. And like this way is just way cheaper than any other way. Of course, in theory, there are other ways of pulling that oxygen off. And I guess that's what they're working on. I haven't looked at the chemistry of what they're doing, actually. Okay. But for the biggest one is the electricity generation. And it's like we have these alternatives, and it's just a question of whether the carbon price is high enough to incentivize the alternatives. So in first best, like you've got coal use in India, China, Germany, US. Okay. Incomes are much higher in Germany and the US than in China, and they're a lot higher in China than in India. So in first best, would the planner sort of say, look, you guys in India, you can keep using coal. The Chinese, you need to switch soon, and the Germans and the Americans, you definitely need to switch already. Is Is that what would happen in first best?
If the tax is based on national GDP, that should happen, because then the carbon tax would be so high that it's too expensive to use. Or?
Okay, but let's think of the let's think of the planner. Okay. So I was kind of a bit ambiguous in what I said, but let's think of first best planner. So there's no tax; it's just the planner's telling everyone what to do. So is the planner going to say to the Indians, "Look, you're poorer, so you should choose cheaper coal, but you richer guys, you need to have a chat about that."
I would expect that, I don't know, that there would be some compensation. But if they stop using it, but
Sounds like you've got similar ideas. Give me some ideas.
yeah, we were thinking that the poorer countries also would stop using, but would be compensated in a way.
So if we've got a social planner, the social planner just tells everyone what to do. So you're saying then in the planner's situation, the planner would say, no, you guys in India, you should also stop using coal, but you guys in Germany and the US should transfer some cash to the Indians at the same time to deal with the sort of distributional issues. What does that fit with what you were saying, or what? So why would that be the case? Not the transfers, but why would the planner tell them all to stop using coal?
Well, the marginal benefits for the poorer countries are higher than the margin of using or of emissions, I guess, because they have more to gain than in the rich countries. So maybe that's
Do they though? If you think of that, the benefit curve, how do we construct that?
well, I mean, if you don't have heating in your house and you emit some to get heating, then your marginal benefit should be higher compared to emitting for producing a piece of candy.
Okay. Yeah, now that is relevant, but I'm thinking of large-scale electricity generation. Okay. There's other issues if you're thinking that people are burning coal in their homes to heat their home. But if we're just thinking we've got massive electricity power plants in India, China, Germany, US, which we have, all running on coal. And the planner tells them all to stop using coal and to use solar or something, rather than just the Germans and the Americans. Why is that? It's correct, that is what the planner would do. And it's actually kind of the opposite of what you were saying. It's because what you were saying isn't true in that case. In the case you were talking about, it might be true, but it's basically, the idea is the cost of switching from coal to solar is the same everywhere. In fact, if you take solar, it will be lower in India than it would be in Germany, because there's more sun in India, right? And stronger sun. And the benefits are the same everywhere, because the pollutant is uniformly mixing if we're just focusing on carbon dioxide. So therefore, clearly, if we just take the simple case and assume the costs are the same everywhere, the benefits are the same everywhere, the planner is going to tell everybody, either it's going to be worthwhile for everybody to switch or nobody. You're not going to differentiate between the countries. Of course, in reality, the Indians may be more reluctant to switch for several reasons. One is with the free riding problem, it's like, well, we don't care about this. Is one, if they're just thinking of free, as being free riders. And then even if they're taking part in a global agreement and everyone's acting together, oh, I lost my thread. But it could still be that, yeah, we're not prepared to take this cost because this is a big cost for us. For you guys, it's nothing. So that would be then, okay, yeah, but we'll compensate you, you know. So that is about international negotiations and so on in reality. But in First Best, you would tell everybody to adopt the non-coal technology more or less at the same time. And to the extent that there are differences, it's probably cheaper, if solar is the alternative, it's cheaper to switch to solar in India than it is in Germany. So you would actually tell the Indians to switch first in the planner's economy. Okay. So this is like really, really important. It's so fundamental. It's like this equimarginal principle, yeah. That in the global First Best, you would take on actions up to a given marginal cost everywhere on the globe, yeah. And so this is what's behind the kind of argument that people like Hassler and Krusell like to make. I don't know if does anyone know who these guys are?
Yes. I hadn't been a course at Stockholm University.
Okay. What course was that?
Climate and the economy.
Yeah. Okay. Was that at bachelor level, or because isn't that that's a master course?
We could choose it as bachelors, but mostly masters.
Yeah. Okay. But you all did the same course.
Yeah.
So you got a kind of master course as part of you.
Yeah, I didn't know that when I chose the course.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I got to look at that course actually. Yeah. So I know them quite well, and they're like Per Krusell is like the most famous or the sort of best economist in Sweden in terms of his publications and so on. And he's got into climate the last 5 or 10 years. So one of the things that they've argued in debate articles and so on is, look, instead of taking these massively expensive on the margin, or doing these extremely expensive things, what do you say in English, whatever. In Sweden, we should be like funding efforts in other countries, which would give much more bang for the buck, right? So if you think, we could spend, 100 million crowns on subsidizing electric cars in Sweden and save, 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. But we could have spent 100 million crowns subsidizing, helping the Indians to get rid of install solar capacity instead of coal-fired and save like 10 times the emissions. This is the kind of point that they've made. And this is all about this equimarginal principle. And of course, there's arguments both ways. You can argue, people have argued, look, we need to be trailblazers, we need to show what can be done, we need to help these infant technologies kick off. There's various other arguments, which still go the other way. Okay. So that was first best. In first best, you would phase down coal globally. It's number one priority. And of course, you wouldn't just close all the coal-fired power stations overnight. It would depend. The newest ones are more efficient than the older ones, and so on. You would close them last. And the brown coal ones you would close first because they have higher emissions per unit of energy output, and so on. But pretty rapid phase down of coal, and you're going to carry on. If you're not in this kind of fat-tailed situations where you think there's a really significant risk of massive damages, but you're more in this area, you're going to carry on using Saudi oil and so on for quite a while. What about outside the fossil arena? What else is the sort of big problem in terms of emissions? What's the other main source of emissions, in a couple of words? And what's it linked to? So 65-70% of emissions are linked to fossil fuel use.
And then use.
It's linked to different ways we're using land, right? And the biggest one is, of course, deforestation. It's cut down forest. And what's the other one? So it's there's the physical okay, you cut down some forest and just burn it up. That is just releasing a lot of carbon dioxide. What's the slightly more subtle one, Fredrik? In terms of, so there's burn up the forest, boom. But where else does carbon dioxide come from in terms of land use?
They're different. I suppose there was animals per se.
I wasn't thinking about that, but yeah. So there's meat. There's carbon dioxide from the trees. Literally, you burn the tree, and then there's methane. What else is there? Let's cut two more things actually. Is anyone actually? I talked about it, I think, in the video. I don't know. Nitrous oxide. So where does that come from?
Is it from fertilizers?
Yeah. So we stick fertilizer on the ground, and some of that just ends up in the air. And then the final one. What's that? Probably can't even see it. It's not what I was thinking of actually. It could have been from the picture, but I'm just thinking when we plow up soils that contain organic matter and drain them, then gradually that organic matter ends up turning to carbon dioxide. So this is and the same if you drain a peat swamp in Sweden or allow it, so you put ditches in and so on, and what you have forestry, then gradually that peat is going to turn into carbon dioxide through the action of bacteria and so on it. So basically, it's a no-brainer to reverse this process in first best. especially like in these tropical areas where the soils are very poor, the productivity is very low. Anyway, it's crazy to be taking this stuff away and trying to grow crops there. We would definitely, in first best, be like eating less beef than we eat today. But how much less? Obviously, we don't know, but it's much easier when there's this alternative technology and you just say, well, look, you know, we switched to this other technology and we know what that costs. So then we can pretty easily, if we do have a model, we can say, okay, at this point it's worth switching.
In this case, to the amount that you still can assure food security, because in certain land use cases you can use it as arable land, so the only way to get food out of it is with ruminants, or cattle or whatever.
That's true, yeah.
So to the case that you don't endanger food security.
Yeah. But this isn't really my area, but I know people whose area it is, and I've talked to them quite a lot, like Elin Rös. I don't know if any of you heard of her. She's got quite a high profile. She sits up there in the MVM building. I think that's pretty marginal. So like the amount of beef that we get from cattle that only graze is like extremely marginal compared to the beef that comes from cattle that are fed on crops. So actually, by eating less meat, we're massively contributing to food security. Definitely on the margin, because if you're doing it for climate reasons, well, even that's complicated actually, but you're going to be cutting down on the beef that is fed by crops. So, but the thing is, the planner cares about people's preferences, and we just don't know kind of how much. If you could tax, if you think of a perfectly regulated economy and you tax farmers you can measure the methane from their cows, and you can put a tax onto the meat that is exactly corresponding to the damages given your social cost of carbon. Then we could say, okay, then the price of the typical beef is going to go up by this much. But we still don't really know, okay, so how much less beef are people going to eat? So we've got someone, Sara Sell, I don't know if any of you met her, but she's postdoc at our department. She's working on that. Demand for food products. Measuring demand systems. And like how much less beef would we eat if we had to pay a certain amount more. But does anyone have a guess, like what's the short answer to that? It's generally similar for all of these things. Do you want to have a guess? So if we raise the price of beef somewhat due to this, how much effect is it going to have on people's consumption choices?
Relatively little.
Not much.
Because the percentage of spending on food is also smaller in the developed countries relative to the income.
That's part of it, but typically for these kinds of products, we're just not that price sensitive. We know what we want to eat. So typically, across the board, the key in first best to getting emissions down is going to be switching technologies rather than changing consumption patterns. Which is kind of ironic because it's the consumption patterns that are shifting we're shifting, a big part of the problem is the shifting consumption patterns. And this is a big part of my research that, Friedrich has heard all about in the other course. That we are shifting the whole time towards emissions intensive stuff and away from low emission stuff. So over time we eat less and less porridge and more beef. Okay. So economic growth, if you like, is not just more and more of the same stuff. We also shift the patterns of our consumption, and those shifts are towards emissions intensive stuff. So the rate at which we fly is, for instance, just another example, is going up a lot faster than our incomes. So we're shifting into flying and out of other things over time as we get richer. And the evidence, there's not that strong evidence at the moment. I'm working as part of my research together with Jonathan Straw, their PhD student, but we're trying to look at, okay, to what extent is this driven by substitution or price effects, and to what extent is it driven by income effects? And the evidence suggests that it's income effects that are the main driver. So as we get richer, we like more beef and more flights, and we're not going to be very affected by price raises. So until we can find a technological solution, and as long as the social cost of carbon isn't very high, we're still, these trends are going to carry on. Or we have some cultural change. And of course with meat consumption that is happening. That it's like, it's getting, for health reasons and climate reasons as well, it's like in the richest countries like Sweden, it's actually going down. Okay, so that is first best. And then what we're going to talk about in the next lecture or two is how to get there in the real world. Okay. Or how to get closer to it in the real world. In the fantasy world, you would just tax emissions at the same rate everywhere. And at the same time, you would correct all the other externalities. Like market power in the fossil fuel sector, and also knowledge spillovers, which we haven't mentioned. Because what's another thing you're going to do in first best, which I forgot to mention, apart from changing the technologies you're using and to some extent changing consumption patterns, what's the third thing you're going to do? I don't know if I talked about this in the video. You're going to switch to green technologies, and you're going to, at least to some extent, switch away from emissions-intensive consumption goods in first best. But there's a third thing you're going to do, which is sort of relatively major importance. So imagine you've got a massive scale switch to solar. How are you going to power your cars, and how are you going to power your planes?
Using batteries?
Very likely. There are potentially other alternatives. Is that like totally unproblematic? Obviously, leading question is not. So what's the problem? What are we going to do about that? Or is there anything we can do about that? So remember, I'm asking you, what is the planner? You've got 7 billion people, or 5 billion, or 4 billion perhaps, who are working age. What is the planner going to tell them to do? The planner's going to tell the ones who are digging up coal, he's going to say, nah, stop that, do something else, make solar panels. And there's going to be a bunch of people doing some other stuff. Yeah, some are going to be making batteries and whatever, but
Research.
right. Research on
New technologies to replace.
the sort of clean technologies or renewable. It's like, if we're ever going to get planes running on electricity, we need better batteries, right? Much better batteries. Alternatively, we need relatively more efficient technologies to use solar power to sort of make kerosene. You can do that in theory. You can take like carbon dioxide and water and electricity and make kerosene. And then put it in the plane, and the plane turns it back into carbon dioxide and water. But it's like hugely expensive. So you're going to put a bunch of people onto research as well. More people, in particular areas. So then the question is, how is the regulator going to achieve that? And also, how is the regulator going to stop the deforestation and so on is another big question. And how is the regulator going to stop people ploughing up draining land? And how is the regulator going to cut meat consumption and make fertilizer applications more efficient? That's what we're going to look at on, is it Monday? And possibly, I can't remember how much we've got left. Does anyone have the schedule at their fingertips?
Oh, sorry.
It's alright, I've got it here. You can't see this, I know, but it's alright. I just want to look at the schedule. Yeah. Oh, okay. Shit. It's only Monday and then Thursday, Friday. Yeah, but that's cool. I'm going to put some videos out before Monday, which will be, so hopefully with the videos and then that session, we can like do the regulatory side of climate. And then we've got Thursday, Friday, kind of almost like, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what we'll do with that time, but there's going to be plenty to do for sure. It depends exactly how I decide we're going to organise the like project thing. It could be if I get that all straight over the weekend, we could use some of that time to like talk about project work. So I'll let you know about that. Okay, we're out of time. So let's call it a day there, unless there's anything anyone wants to ask that is kind of important for everyone, you know, that they think is good to know for everyone or whatever. Okay, let's leave it there then. And it's Friday today, isn't it? I spent all of yesterday thinking it's Friday. So enjoy your weekends, and just let me know. Yeah, I've got a few minutes now if anyone wants to talk about anything.
I won't be here on